about it, anytime two people speak, they have to decide when is your turn done and my turn begins. And we judge by a number of things. We listen for the intonation pattern, we listen to think if your point is made, but we also listen for a pause. Now, some people, some conversational styles, let's say you're expecting this much pause. Other conversational styles, you're expecting this much pause. Now, when you start talking to each other, this much pause comes first. And when it comes, the people who have this conversational style, when you start getting past that amount, that speaker becomes uncomfortable. I guess you have nothing to say. I've given you enough pause and you're not saying anything. So, because I'm a good person and I want to keep the conversation going, I fill that pause. And I keep giving you these pauses, but you're not taking them, so I keep filling them. And you end up with a situation where one person is doing all the talking and the one who's waiting for the longer pause never gets to say anything. And that is one of the things that was happening at the Thanksgiving dinner conversation that I talked about. And this is an example of complementary schismogenesis, that because of a small difference, pausing, you end up polarized into very large differences, not talking at all on the one hand and doing all the talking on the other. It's important to keep in mind that these differences in pacing, pausing, as well as everything else, is always relative. It's never absolute. It's always a function of how your style compares with the styles of the people you're talking to. And I'll illustrate this in pacing and pausing. I've already characterized my style as being from New York, actually, Brooklyn, New York. And so I grew up in an environment where the assumption was that you don't have long pauses. In fact, you don't have any pauses in conversation, because conversational pauses means the conversation is breaking down. And so to be a good person, you have to talk. You know, it's a way of showing your participation, your enthusiastic listenership. And a term I use is involvement. You're a good person by showing your involvement. Maybe on that dynamic. This is a way of showing you're close, that you're participating in the conversation. When I talked to my colleague Ron Scollin, who grew up in Michigan, I have learned over time that I need to count to 7 after I think Ron has nothing to say. And usually, amazingly, he will actually start to talk. Now, it's not that I'm a fast talker and Ron's a slow talker. Ron is married to Suzanne Scollin. She is Chinese American. She grew up in Hawaii. And Susie's sense of pause is longer than Ron's. And so Ron is a fast talker when he's talking to Susie. And Susie complains to Ron, you know, you ask me a question and you don't give me a chance to answer it. You're asking another question before I can even start to answer. So when Ron and Susie talk, he's the fast talker, she's the slow talker. Now, Ron and Susie have done some of their research up in a village called Fort Chip among Athabascan Indians in Alaska. And Athabascan Indians have longer pauses than Anglos in general. In fact, those who have studied Athabascan languages and discourse have found that questions are often, people don't feel they have to answer a question right away. In fact, you might ask a question and get the answer tomorrow, or maybe even later than that. So there isn't that feeling that you ask a question, the person has to answer right away. And so there's much more comfort with silence in Athabascan culture than in Western culture, Anglo culture. So when Ron and Susie were working in Fort Chip, where they did their work, Susie was the one who was constantly interrupting Athabascans and talking all the time, because she wasn't leaving long enough pauses for them to feel comfortable to start to talk. Now, how much farther can we go? Well, Ron and Susie had a conference once up in Alaska, and I was a participant in the conference, and they sent me to a village just inside the Arctic Circle called Fort Yukon. And I went in on a bush flight and spent the day just to see what an Athabascan village was like. And Ron actually put on his midterm exam for his students in Alaska. Deborah Tannen went to Fort Yukon, and what do you think was her experience there? And most of them actually came up with the answer. Deborah Tannen comes from a culture where you talk to get to know each other. in the Athabascan village, you don't talk to strangers, so probably nobody talked to her. And what actually happened was that after about 2 hours, I broke down and called the local missionary so somebody would talk to me. But Ron told me about a particularly interesting response that he got from a student who was from the northernmost village in the Arctic Circle. And that student said, well, people in Fort Yukon talk so fast, she probably fit right in. Well, I give that example to reinforce